Dr. Sonia Malik. Ma'am is a very famous IVF specialist and she is the director of South End Fertility and IVF Centers, got branches all over Delhi, in Basant Vihar, Gurgaon, at Saket, at Rajouri Garden. Ma'am is now founder and director of these centers, and she has got so many awards, starting from Lifetime Achievement Award from IMA in 2015. She has received the Jagdishwari Prasad Mishra OBST Gynec Award in 2014 for oration. She has been declared the IMS South Delhi Award for Professional Excellence. In 2010, Fellowship Indian College of ICOG. 2007, Scientific Collaborator Reproductive Research Center, the Cleveland Clinic, Ohio. IMA Kanak Goel Award, membership Indian College of, that is, she's received the MICOG also. Chairman's Appreciation Award, IMA Academy of Medical Sciences. President's Appreciation Award, IMA South Delhi. Scroll of Honor for Exemplary Service to Indian Menopause Society, IMS Ahmedabad. IMA Dr. Kanak Goel Award again in 2004. And the list goes on and on. Ma'am's positions have been numerous: Secretary General of Indian Menopause Society, President of IMS, editorial board of so many forums. She's been the Chief Editor of Journal of Midlife Health, Chairman, Scientific Committee of IFFS, and also the President IFS. I welcome Dr. Sonia Malik. She is a person whom I think each one of us in the forum love to hear and love her as the person. Dr. Sonia Malik.
Ma'am, you can start sharing with your slides.
My Wi-Fi is a bit in between, so I couldn't hear you all. But nevertheless, thank you so much for being so kind to me always. I feel a part of the East Delhi Forum as always, and it is always welcome to come here for any activity, whatever you ask me to come for. Thank you so much. And I would now like to share my screen with you all. Can you all see my screen, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. 1 minute. I'll come to what does it mean to be a part of this webinar, to be connected with everybody visually, virtually, and like this rather than actual. You know why I said this was because during this interaction, I could see some of my South Delhi friends. I could spot Manju Gupta. She's in Saket and she's here today with all of us. She is also witnessing this. So it's great to have people. Earlier we could not. We must actually thank Corona for some good things also, because earlier we could not actually, do this, and now we are in a better position to kind of see each other and do things together. So I don't know why this is coming anyway. It's turning again, and what is happening? Prashant, I don't know what is happening now.
Ma'am, it's coming like an annotation kind of a thing in on your slide right now.
Decisions and progesterone and update, and basically related to contraception and of course the non-contraceptive uses. So let me just run you through all this. First of all, let us take a few facts. There's something that we don't generally bother to read about, and what we don't actually like to do. What are the contraceptive trends in this country? You can see over here, there's a huge growth in the number of women who have started using contraceptive methods. And sometimes when we say that the fertility rate is declined, it may be actually also because lots of women are also resorting to contraceptive means. It may not just mean that the infertility is increasing. It also can mean that the patients are willingly using or resorting to contraceptive methods. And that is why, we find this kind of a decrease. And if you look at the contraceptive usage of the country, 47% are still not using anything, and female sterilization constitutes a major part of the contraceptive usage in the country. And if you look at what we are going to discuss today, it is a mere 4.1% of the total usage of contraception in the country. So actually that is not too much, but then yes, it is also growing, as you can see. It has grown over the years, and therefore there is a need to talk about it. However, having said that, if you again look at the discontinuation rate of the contraceptive methods, you see here that the pill is faring very badly. out of all the methods, you find that 42% are actually discontinuing also. So therefore, and of course, there are other methods which are also there, but again, percentage discontinuation is quite high. And also, the met need for limiting is also increased, which is about 48%. So overall, when you look at the status of the contraception, and if you look at the way people are now willing to use contraception, it just means that we are much better as a nation, and we have become that aware. The awareness for contraception and family planning has increased, and people are resorting to some kind of means in order to space their families. However, a very interesting part of the report is that although there are so many eligible couples and the highest share is that of female sterilization, the contraceptive failure rates have also gone down. But the contraceptive pills under the government's family planning scheme currently needs a government's prescription. And this practice was brought about last year in view of the emergency contraceptive pills that we have been using. However, the government wants to tweak this law and to resume over-the-counter sale of contraceptives under the central government scheme. And the emergency contraceptives, though are readily available over-the-counter usage, contraceptive usage may also start. Now let us look at the reason why this would have happened. We are sometimes surprised and we are always fearful because we know that contraceptives have side effects. We know that hormones have side effects. But therefore, what we want to know why this is, why the government has actually resorted to this. Now look at this. Look at the source of contraceptive methods that the patients are getting. So in a distribution of aged 15 to 49 years who are current users, the public health sector accounts for 69%, and the private health clinics and the hospital clinics account for 24% of procurement of contraceptives to the people. Contraceptive means all kinds of contraceptives. It's not just pills, but all kinds. But if you look at the breakdown, just concentrate on this. The private doctor clinic accounts, and the last part over here is the pill. Is the pill. The first is sterilization, and here it is the pill. So about 13% of our patients out of a total private health sector of 59.7%, 13.3% of people are procuring their pills from the private. 36% of them are directly taking them from the pharmacy. So imagine what is the strength of the chemist. He prescribes more contraceptive pills as compared to you who are the doctors. This is 3 times, nearly 3 times. So here again, if you look at the rural belt, this was the urban belt. Now if you look at the rural belt again, the private doctor's clinic is accounting for here 13.3, again similar to the urban. And what is happening in the pharmacy, again about 33% of the people are getting their from the pharmacy. So look at the strength that the common man, you see, that is what, because the patients don't believe what the doctor is saying, but what the chemist tells them is actual truth. So they believe the chemist and they take whatever they want from there. So this is an interesting trend which you can notice over here. Private hospitals account for just 3.6% of the total contraceptives that are procured, private hospitals. But the private doctors are good, 13.3%, not bad. However, the chemist overpowers everybody, and probably that is the reason the government decided, in order to push the contraceptive pills and in order to push the usage of these, the government is probably saying that it should be available off the counter. So with this little introduction, I thought this would be interesting for all of you, because we hardly ever look at our data. This is from the national data of 2015 and 2016. It was published in 2016. It is from the 2014 census. So basically, it is not so old, and I'm sure there would have been improvement now. So coming to our main topic of today, we all know that the idea of using hormones for contraception was started way back in 1920, when the ovarian hormones were first discovered. And it was only in the 1950 that synthetic versions of the hormone were developed, known as progestogens. And the first trial of combined oral contraceptive pills took place in Puerto Rico in 1956. And these were the pioneers who actually started to work on it. So what is the mechanism of action of the COC components? We all know that there are 2 components to it, the estrogen as well as the progestogen. And the estrogen on one side, the mechanism of action, it suppresses the FSH release from the anterior pituitary. It increases the concentration of progesterone receptors and it enhances the progestogen effect. This keeps happening, I don't know why. And what is the result of all this? It inhibits follicular development, there is endometrial stabilization, and it enables the progesterone dose reduction because it enhances the effect of progesterone. On the other hand, progesterone suppresses the LH release from the anterior pituitary, thereby inhibiting the ovulation. It has an effect on the cervical mucus, it thickens it, and therefore it makes it impervious to sperm penetration. And of course, it causes decidualization of the endometrium, which actually becomes atrophied as well and does not remain receptive to the embryo anymore. With this effect, these two hormones are actually acting in the oral contraceptive pills. So, what are the side effects of yeah. So then what happens is, what is happening here? Yeah. So now what happened is that initially we all know this actually as gynecologists, that initially the side effects of estrogens were increased because of the dose of estrogen. And what happened was that earlier we used to give a very high dose of estrogen. There was bloating, tenderness, and nausea, and more than 50% where 35 milligrams of ethinyl estradiol was used. But when this dose was reduced to 20, all these side effects decreased. So that is why it was finally inferred from all these studies that you give lesser amount of estrogen to produce the same kind of result and it would be effective. So the high dose of estrogen was linked to thromboembolic phenomena and also, coronary effects. So therefore, in a combined or sequential pills, 30 to 40 microgram of estrogen are associated with 1/3 reduced risk as compared to 50 microgram estrogen. Gradually, they decided to reduce the dose of estrogen from 50 to 30 and then again just the progesterone only pill. This was a study which was conducted to see what is the effect of the pills in different doses, and when no pills was given to any patient, what is the effect on the thromboembolic phenomena. And they found that was a marked difference between what was found with high doses as compared to those who were taking only progesterone and others who were just not taking anything. Therefore, it was finally decided to decrease the dose of estrogen in the pill. So as per Spiroff, the estrogen content of the pill is a major thing. It is of major importance. And thrombosis is one of the most serious side effects of the pill, with estrogen playing a key role with increased risk of death from a variety of circulatory problems. And this side effect is definitely related to estrogen, which is also dose related. Therefore, the dose of estrogen has been reduced gradually from 150 to 50 to 35 to 30, and now the low dose pills, which are 20. And we find that even with 20 micrograms, the contraceptive effect or the efficacy of the drug has not decreased. So, of course, the side effects like nausea, tenderness, etc., has all decreased a lot. Coming then to the progestogen component. Now, again, the second pill was the progesterone, which was there, and we found that progesterone, levonorgestrel, and norethisterone have been used since 1960. However, the first and second generation progesterones contain norethisterone, levonorgestrel, and they tended to exhibit androgenic actions. They were actually androgenic and they were counterbalancing the estrogenic activity that we required. Therefore, a third generation of progestogens such as gestodine and desogestrel, which was structurally related to progesterone, were developed, and these have a greater specificity of progesterone receptors and a reduced potential for androgenic estrogenic glucocorticoid effects. Then the third generation of progesterone like drospirenone, which is a effect, was also developed, which is specifically used in patients like PCOS, and a cyproterone, which has an anti-androgenic effect, which is beneficial for some people with severe acne. So the third generation progestogens became more specific to the needs of the person. They were all acting on the progesterone receptors. They were all having different side effects beneficial effects, I would say, are required and hence could be selectively used for patients who are being prescribed this for non-contraceptive reasons or even for contraceptive reasons, but for say a PCO or say for having acne. So accordingly, you could select your oral contraceptive pills depending upon what third generation progesterone is available in that. So here is the list of the first generation, which were the estrogens and pregnanes, and the second generations were gonane derived from testosterone, and the third generation was levonorgestrel, and the fourth generation now is the non-ethylated estrogens, where you have dinogest and drospirenone, and the pregnanes, where you have nestorenone. I think none of these are yet available in India, but these are the ones which are further developed. So basically, the hormonal contraceptives are the most important agent which suppress ovulation. So again, coming back to the same thing, now, what was the rationale for doing this? Why did we want to develop all this? The evolution was focused basically on reducing the androgenic effects. They were focused on the related interaction with the receptors other than the progesterogenic receptor, that means androgen receptor and lipid effects, glucocorticoid receptors and water retention and bloating, and mineralocorticoid decreasing the water retention and weight. Hence, the focus was to actually have progestogens which would focus only on the progesterone receptor and not on these other receptors, so that the side effects were decreased. Similarly, the synthetic progestogens used for contraception were derived from testosterone or progesterone, that means 17-hydroxyprogesterone derivative, giving a high specificity of progesterone receptor and a low affinity for other steroid receptors, making this a desirable attribute. And what is important for all of us is that although we were actually focusing on them, we have certain progestogens which are effective for reasons other than what we want. And we shall see how that has happened. Look at these progestogens, look at cyproterone acetate. Now here you find that it has an anti-estrogenic effect, it has an anti-androgenic effect also, whereas levonorgestrel does not have an anti-androgenic effect. So you could be selective in what we are trying to give. And similarly, you have the other desogestrel. Desogestrel is an anti-estrogen and it has got a variable kind of an anti-androgenic effect. So you can be selective in the choice of your contraceptive pill depending on what you want to put it to. In addition to the patient being requiring a contraceptive, there may be other non-contraceptive benefits or non-contraceptive reasons why you want to prescribe the progesterone. And therefore, in this whole huge list of progesterone, you can be selective about it. What does the progesterone actually, what is happening to the metabolism which is actually making it so good? So let's look at SHBG. This is an enzyme which we are all very, very familiar with. And we all know that it is produced by the liver. Actually, SHBG is controlled by, secretion is controlled by the presence of the sex hormones, both androgen and estrogen. And a high estrogen increases SHBG secretion from the liver, whereas a high androgen decreases the SHBG secretion. So therefore, if you want the androgens to be decreased, you have to actually counter it by giving estrogen, because that is going to release the SHBG. So SHBG has more affinity to bind to free androgens than free estrogen. So it binds to the free androgens and therefore it decreases the androgen secretion. So androgen is increased and androgen is increasing the action. Estrogen is also increasing the action, but it also increases the SHBG. SHBG, when it is increased, the free testosterone is decreased. So SHBG binds to the sex hormones and makes them inactive. Now let us look at this beautiful cartoon. This is the liver, and these are the two molecules. The green one is the estrogen, and the red one is the androgen. Now what happens is, they are secreted in the liver, and the SHBG comes in. It comes in from the liver, and it gets bound to the estrogen as well as the androgen. And then what happens is, if there is an androgen dominance, then most of these, which are the androgen molecules, will go and stick. After the SHBG gets bound to them, there will be very little left. If the SHBG is there, then it is going to be bound. But if it is not very active, then free testosterone is going to be more. and hence the action of the free testosterone will be on the molecules, on the androgen receptors. It will catch hold of the androgen receptor and therefore have its androgenic effect. So SHBG actually controls the free testosterone from acting on the androgenic receptor and producing the androgenic effects on the body. Hence, the importance of SHBG. If SHBG is normal, then the androgens will be well controlled. But if the SHBG level is low, then what is going to happen is we are going to have more testosterone in the body. So here is the same thing which has been explained very well. And you have acne and hirsutism becoming prominent because the receptors are caught by the androgens and therefore it is producing a clinical effect of acne and hirsutism. The unbound testosterone rises and it produces these effects on the body. Now, what are the effects of the components or pill components on androgenicity and lipids? The estrogen increases the LDL, HDL, and triglycerides, and the combination of estrogen and progesterone, which constitutes the oral contraceptive, modifies the effect of estrogen to some extent and decreases it. However, the target identification is basically the deletion of, now this is the development of the new molecule desogestrel from the molecule levonorgestrel because of the deletion of the oxygen molecule at position 3 and methyl group at position 11. However, as clinicians, this should not basically interest us very much, but it only means, why we want to know this is because this methylation, this removes the androgenic side effects that we find in this particular molecule. So the idea of producing a new molecule was to decrease the androgenic molecule, androgenic effect, and at the same time, increasing the progestogenic effect of that molecule. So look at the binding capacity of this molecule, which is desogestrel. You find that its effect on the relative binding to the progesterone receptor is amazing. It is equal to levonorgestrel, but it is amazing. The androgen receptor on this, at the same time is less as compared to levonorgestrel. Estrogen receptor, it has no effect on that. And glucocorticoid also is 14, about 14, as compared to levonorgestrel, which is 1, and it has no effect on the mineralocorticoid receptor. So this molecule, as any other molecule, for instance, you see all these, and you find that there is a selection, all these, and here you have the drosperinone, which has a very big mineralocorticosteroid receptor affinity. So it produces different effects. This is what this is. This means that in vitro, progesterone binding is selective, and the receptors to which the progesterone stick to are different depending upon the molecular formation of that progesterone. So the selectivity index means that if there is a high progestogenic activity versus a low progestogenic activity, it means that the selectivity index of that particular progesterone is high. So again, you see over here that it has a net very high selectivity index because basically it has a high progestogenic activity, but at the same time, a low androgenic activity. So, and all of them have been put together. Ethinyl estradiol and desogestrel, as you all know, is a very, very common combination which we all have been using under the name Femilon. And we all know that it contains, it is a monophasic oral contraceptive which we all have been using. And in its multicentric trial was conducted in 267 centers to evaluate the efficacy and acceptability of this molecule. And 13,000 patients were followed for a total of 74,967 cycles. You can see that such an intensive and huge trial was done with so much of data. And this does suggest that the acceptability and efficacy of these is very, very good. The Pearl index was 0.0 and the failure was just 0.4 patient failure. So you can see over here that the failure rate of this contraceptive pill is amazing. It's very, very low. The incidence is very low. And of course, breakthrough bleeding also in the first cycle may be a little less, a little more because of its low estrogen content. But as the patient keeps on taking more cycles, the breakthrough bleeding also decreases. In the side effects are minimal as compared to the others. And because basically we have been very careful in constituting it with lower amount of estrogen and the right kind of progesterone. So if you look at this molecule, as far as its contraceptive efficacy is concerned, this contraceptive, which contains 150 micrograms of desogestrel and 30 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol, is shown to be very reliable, and the cycle control is very good. The general incidence and complaints are low. Again, we've undergone so many years of trial, and we found that there has been very, very good result as far as the pregnancy rate is concerned. The incidence is extremely low. What is the effect on the lipid profile? Again, this was a trial that looked at the efficacy, the cycle control, the blood pressure, and the lipid profile by dividing these patients into two groups. In one group, they gave desogestrel and ethinyl estradiol, and in the second group, they gave levonorgestrel and ethinyl estradiol, where levonorgestrel was 30, and this was a triphasic pill in group 2, where in the first group they gave a monophasic pill, and in the second group they gave LNG in addition to that as a triphasic pill. So the third group was norethindrone and ethinyl estradiol. So 3 groups were made, and all 3 groups received different combinations, and it was basically seen what was the efficacy, the control, and the blood pressure of these patients. So when they looked at the metabolic effects and the lipid control of these patients over a period of 5 years, what they found was that in the initial cycles, the breakthrough bleeding was minimal in the first group, which was the drug that we are talking about, and in the second group and third group, it was more. So similarly, spotting was also different. It was much less in the first group. What was the increase in weight in these 3 groups? Again, the weight gain initial was comparable, nearly the same, but however, later on, they found a difference in the 3 groups. What happened to the lipid profile then? Again, they found that the initial normal value was 159 versus 167 and 168. If you look at the p-value, there wasn't much difference in this. However, after many cycles, they found that there was no alterations in the total lipid and total cholesterol. Again, if you look at the HDL changes, 27.7, 26, 28, kind of similar over a longer period of time. So, when they looked at the HDL levels in subjects from group 2 after stopping the LNG pills, now they stopped them and then saw what was the difference between the group 2, that means the monophasic group and the triphasic group. What did they find? They found that 20.3% added. The HDL level was in 20.3 was little higher as compared to 22.5 in the triphasic group. Again, in this one, it was 30.2 as compared to 29.2 in the triphasic group. And after 48 cycles, it was nearly the same, that means 36 and 34. So, if you look at the graph over here, you will find that in group 2, monophasic, over a period of time, it kept on, there was an increase in the HDL as compared to in both of them. So the conclusion was that it has 100% contraceptive efficacy. There is no impact on the blood pressure with all the kinds of pills. There was minimal weight change users even after 5 years of continuation, and an increase in the HDL component is seen in this DSG plus EE, which is consistent with the consumption, and anabolic effects of LNG and NET were observed, which of course were not there with this one. There were minimal side effects and a very favorable lipid profile makeup of the combination of desogestrel and ethinyl estradiol. So the conclusion is that high doses of estrogen component have been associated with adverse effect. High progesterogenic activity and low androgenic activity is desirable. Desogestrel has a high selectivity to progesterogenic receptors and a low selectivity to androgenic receptors, and an increase in HDL component of desogestrel is consistent with the consumption of the drug. So these are the favorable points in this combination. So when we look at the evidence and the summaries of various different types of groups, groups of progestogens, what do we find? So in a Cochrane analysis of all the types of progestogens that have been used, what did they find was, this was a review which was done to see the efficacy the discontinuation rates and the reason for discontinuation, what was the cycle control, and what were the side effects of these drugs. And what did they found? This 50 trials were included, and a total of 13,000 again patients were taken. The pregnancy and discontinuation rate between drospirenone and desogestrel was similar. Overall, similar number of women in both groups reported side effects, except for breast tenderness, which was more common in the drospirenone group. There was a trend towards more nausea and vomiting also in the drospirenone group. So the summary findings were that these were not, pregnancies were not affected. Discontinuation was slightly less as compared to desogestrel, drospirenone. Cycle disturbance was less and side effects were not there. So pregnancy rates were comparable. Third generation were less likely to discontinue. Third generation group experienced less intermenstrual bleeding, and compared to desogestrel, women on drospirenone had more breast tenderness and nausea. When we compared desogestrel with cyproterone acetate, now this is for a different reason. We are looking at acne and hirsutism here. So there was a decrease in percentage of severe to moderate acne, which was statistically significant with desogestrel and with CPA, both of them. Both preparations increased plasma levels of SHBG, and this seemed to decrease the total and free testosterone, but no statistical significance was found between the severity and biochemical variables of acne. So both this desogestrel and CPA containing COCs were effective in the treatment of moderate to severe acne, which is seen in some patients requiring contraception. So it's not just that you can give only that, you can also give this combination. Now this was about we were talking about the third generation progestogens and their use as contraceptives, and what we have realized is that the third generation contraceptive pills are more effective than the second generation pills, and that they are more friendly to the lipids, and that they are more friendly with the lipids, and they are more actually can be used for a longer period without having exposed the patient to side effects of the drugs. Now, what are the non-contraceptive uses of oral contraceptive pills? So what is the rationale of using it? We should look at that. What are the hormones that go wrong, or what happens to the hormones once the OCP treatment is given? What are the indications for use, and what is the efficacy of these hormones when they are used for non-contraceptive reasons? And how much time does it take for the fertility to be done if you are giving the contraceptive pill for the patient for some other reason? So the rationale, of course, of using this is they have an effect on the hormone environment of the entire reproductive axis, as you all know, and they are mainly used for two reasons in infertility treatment. One is to homogenize the ovarian response. That means when you have cysts or when there is asynchronous growth of the follicles. And the second use is to suppress the LH, in these women. So these are mainly the two reasons, either to prevent an asynchronous growth or to give it in cases of cysts of the ovary, and then of course LH suppression. So what are the basic effects of hormone on the environment? The steroids affect the hormonal environment differently before and after ovarian stimulation, and therefore the suppressive and rebound effects of various steroids vary according to the type and dose, because it has a different effect on the body. So OCP and amount to wash out from the body. So suppose your patient has been given some kind of an estrogen or progesterone, how many days do you have to wait before you start stimulating the patient? Suppose you've given a birth control pill to suppress the LH. Do you have to wait for the period to come up, or you can just start the stimulation? That is what this tells us. So if the patient has been on estrogen in the luteal phase, that means you have given some estrogen, say for 7 days, it needs a washout day of only 1 day. That means you have to give a gap of 1 day and you can start. So today you stop the estrogen and give a gap of 1 day, and you can start with the stimulation. If the patient has been on medroxyprogesterone acetate, for instance, or norethistron, you stop for 1 to 3 days, and then you can start, irrespective of the period. There is no need to wait for the period. You just have to wait for 1 or 2 to 3 days for the washout of the pill. And what about OCP? Because OCP is going to take longer to get washed out from the body, you have to wait for at least 5 days for its washout before you can start stimulating this patient. So that is what it means if you are basically putting the patient on something which is meant for non-contraceptive use. You must also understand and know when you have to start the stimulation so that you don't interfere with the hormonal milieu of the woman's body. So what are the indications? You are using oral contraceptive pills, or you are using progesterone and estrogen in these patients majorly in PCOS, in endometriosis, COH, and IVF. I have not included frozen embryo transfers because we are not talking of IVF today. How about PCO? We all know that it is a heterogenic disorder, and it is basically has ovarian androgen overproduction and is associated with insulin resistance and obesity. So the major symptoms you all know are these: menstrual disorders and hyperandrogenemia, metabolic syndrome, and infertility. And in order to, these are the causes that cause infertility in these patients. We all know that there may be an altered FSH-LH ratio, hyperinsulinemia, hyperandrogenemia, and most importantly, arrested anterior follicle development. So we all know that about 13 to 19 million, that means we have about 10. The incidence of PCO varies from 10 to even 30% in some of the states in the country, and most of them, about 50%, will be attending the fertility clinics of the country. So the action is basically estrogen forms a negative feedback loop by inhibiting the production of GnRH, and in the COC, it makes use of the negative loop and suppresses the hypothalamus and the pituitary over here, and therefore the feedback is reduced, the FSH-LH secretion is reduced. Mostly it is used to suppress the LH in these patients. So combined oral pills, negative feedback on LH secretion, there is a decreased production of androgen, and therefore the FSH-LH ratio is again corrected. So once the physiological FSH and LH levels are reached, the FSH levels can be gradually increased to induce ovulation. So a pre-treatment with COC in patients of PCO helps to control the time of ovarian stimulation. This was a study design which was done in the year 2012, and this is a Japanese study where they looked at 85 patients with PCO undergoing IVF, and they randomized into an OCP group and a control group. And pre-treatment of OCP significantly reduced the formation of ovarian cysts, remarkably increased the duration of gonadotrophin stimulation and consumption, and markedly raised the percentage of mature ova. So it definitely has a beneficial effect on synchronizing the growth as well as bringing more follicles into the cohort for ovulation and ovulation induction. Similarly, this was another study where the suppression of the ovary with oral contraceptive resulted in excellent ovulation and pregnancy rate. And again, this is not a very old study. However, it is of 2003, where they used OCPs and then they used clomiphene. And there was the number of ovulation was 71%, ovulatory cycles increased, the endometrium was very good, and the cumulative pregnancy was about 54%. And whereas in the control group, you can see in this group, it was very poor, it was just about 4%, and the ovulatory cycles were also minimal. So this was a very significantly good change that they found in patients who were clomiphene resistant earlier. So in the clomiphene resistant cases, they again found that before doing an IUI, if you give OCPs for about 2 months, then it gives good clinical pregnancy rate and good folliculogenesis. Excellent ovulation and also happens when you are suppressing it, because basically the ovulatory cycles have increased in such cases. So the Indian guidelines, also PCO guidelines that we made in year 2014, also suggest that in difficult cases of PCO, you may give a combined OCP treatment with or without lifestyle modification for at least 2 months in subfertile PCO having a high LH level. That means 3 times the basal level to normalize it. This is particularly important for India because we don't have a very poor, rich population where you can keep on giving so much. The other dose, the other combination which is suggested, or other method which is suggested in such patients is to give low dose, very low dose recombinant FSH to these patients. Of course, they will stimulate. It will take a longer time, but they will stimulate over a longer period once this dose is given. But it makes the cycle more expensive. So it is better to pre-treat with OCP and then start doing the stimulation. What about endometriosis? Again, in endometriosis, we all know the pathology in endometriosis, and you all know that the typical symptom may be either pain or infertility, and these are the two reasons why the patients present to us. In these patients also, OCPs have been used, but they have limitations. They cause reduction in the menstrual flow, they reduce the decidualized ectopic endometrium, and they can be taken indefinitely, generally more acceptable to women than alternative treatments which improve the compliance. You all know that progestins have been given in endometriosis for a long time, and oral pills have also been given as a continuous combined method that we keep on giving it for 2 or 3 months without a break so that the patient doesn't get a period, and that definitely reduces the endometriosis. However, this use of oral pills for a long time is off-label in patients of endometriosis, but if you wish, you can give it to the patient after taking consent. So this was a trial which was done pre-ART to see what is the effect of oral pills on the endometriosis, and you can see over here that there was a remarkable difference in the endometriosis correction and the correction of the pain in these patients, where it was given for 6 to 8 weeks, just like the long protocol where you're giving GnRH analog. Instead of that, you pre-treat them with OCPs and then start the stimulation. What about ovulation induction now? We are, of course, all of us have been using oral pills for ovulation induction. So what are the indications and what is actually happening? So because of the suppressive effect on the HQ axis, they have been used for pre-treatment to have a better cyclical control of in stimulated cycle, to reduce the retention cyst, and for cycle rescheduling. Mainly people have been using it for cycle rescheduling because in clinics where they are batching their IVFs, they put the patient on OCP and start the stimulation once the batch is fully constructed. So for cycle rescheduling, or if you don't want to do your pickups on Saturdays and Sundays, there also you can use OCPs to schedule your cycle accordingly, and of course to reduce the retention cyst. They also offer a preventive, these are also act as a preventive against functional ovarian cysts, which can be used for this purpose as well. However, to prevent the capturing of a luteal cyst in an agonist cycle, which can happen due to a flare effect, we have always been using it whenever we have to do the long protocol. First, you give some amount of OCP for some day, and then you supplement it with the GnRH analog so that the GnRH agonist. So, pre-treatment of oral, these are some studies which are also done to see how it can reduce the incidence of hyperstimulation in patients of IVF. So in suspected patients of high responders, if you give them a pre-treatment and down-regulate them with GnRH agonists, that means a long protocol is given. In those cases also, you may moderately reduce their ovarian reserve and also decrease the amount of gonadotropin that may be used, thereby preventing the early OHSS in these patients. So in the OC schedule, now sorry, I should have labeled this slide. It's very busy also, but what is basically the crux of this is that there is no difference in the OC schedule GnRH antagonist versus a GnRH agonist cycle. There is no difference, although the suppression may be more profound at the start of stimulation, but when you consider it as a whole, then you find that there is actually no difference in the ongoing pregnancy rate between these two groups of patients. So when for pre-treatment is one, then selection of protocol, there is really no difference. You can use it for any of the two protocols to make the cycle better. But what is the effect also on the endometrium is something that we need to consider. So if this was a study where in 2012, when they used long-term combined OCP use, they studied for 5 years that can potentially affect optimal endometrial growth, leading to a higher cancellation rate and a longer stimulation and frozen embryo. So these findings suggest that there can be an adverse long-term side effect of OCP if these patients are actually wanting to get pregnant in the future. So if a patient has been on OCPs for a long time, which the PCO patients will be, you may not find patients who are infertile and on contraceptive usage for a long time, but yes, the PCO patient may be on contraceptive pills for a long time because of a hirsutism and acne, and there you may find that the endometrium is adversely affected. You will find a consistently thin endometrium in such patients when you are trying to stimulate them. So what about its use in IVF? I will briefly touch upon this. Pre-treatment seems to result in fewer pregnancy rates. Now, in IVF, again, there is a controversy on the use of oral contraceptives as against estrogen. What is said is that estrogen definitely improves the cycle result, but if you are giving OCP, somehow or the other, it becomes detrimental, and especially if the OCP has been used for a cycle, it has been used for the whole length, not just 5 days or 6 days, but if you use it for many days, then it can have a harmful effect on the outcome of the cycle. Also, there are more days of gonadotrophin therapy that are used, which is seen higher amounts of gonadotrophin may be needed. So a pre-treatment with progestogen is associated with better pregnancy rate and fewer ovarian cysts. So in IVF, whenever we are trying to synchronize the cycle, or whenever we are trying to see that we get normal good number of follicles of the same size, we either pre-treat with progestogen or we pre-treat with estrogen. So estrogen pre-treatment is definitely better in cases where you're anticipating an asynchronous growth, as in a poor responder. The progestogen pre-treatment is better when you want to reduce the LH, because progestogen is a better LH suppressor as compared to estrogen. So you can be selective in these two molecules. You can give one for one and the other for the other. So pre-treatment, like I said, it did facilitate scheduling of the cycles, but in a small subset of patients, it was associated with a low LH level, hence a reduced ovarian response and early pregnancy loss. Similarly, in a GnRH antagonist multi-dose protocol cycle with OCP pre-treatment, it was effective, just as effective as the GnRH agonist group. However, protocol in poor responders can be of advantage because of the shortened time duration for ovulation maturation and diminished amount of RFSH which is required to provide adequate stimulation. So in certain subgroups, these things can be good, but not for all patients. You should not be giving OCPs pre-treatment to all patients, but you have to be very selective in the kind of patient that you want to give it. Ongoing pregnancy rates, I said, was similar in both of them. We mentioned this earlier also. And most of it, this is a very recent report of 2015, they say that any of the pre-treatment with GnRH is associated with a significantly lower chance of ongoing pregnancy. So the available data is actually telling us that pre-treatment with OCPs in any kind of cycle should be taken with caution, even in very few cases, because it definitely has an impact on the pregnancy rate. So coming back to nearly the end of what I'm trying to tell you, should we screen all patients? This is something that many patients will ask you, or you will ask yourself. So this is an Escherichia Capri workshop of 1998, where they actually sat together and decided whether we should be really screening our patients for everything, like for, we are scared of thromboembolic phenomena, we are scared that they might have a heart attack, they might do anything. So whenever we are going to put a patient with OCP, should we be doing that kind of intensive screening, or should it be limited to only such? So who are the patients, or what is the criteria where screening is required? That is early detection of a natural history of disease. The test characteristics should be known, whether the test is cost effective or not, whether the test is acceptable to the user and provider. The test should influence the clinical decisions, and adequate treatment exists for abnormal results and detected disease, and pill users are at a different risk if suggesting differential screening. So basically, when you are ordering a test, you must be able to justify why you are ordering that test. You just cannot see the factor 5 laden ke liye test kara liya ya thrombophilia ke liye kara liya because we are putting the patient on OCP. You should not be doing that unless there is a specific reason and you can justify the test that you are using. Otherwise, what is suggested is simple measures. You just have to take the BP of the patient, blood sugar of the patient, check the lipid profile and the liver function test. These are something which we should do, especially in patients where there is a risk of all this, where there is a risk to the patient. And I would also warn for non-contraceptive uses where you are having an older patient coming to you for wanting a pregnancy. We now have patients of 40 years, 45 years who are also wanting pregnancies by third-party reproduction. In those patients, the screening for all these diseases is a must. And in those patients, if you want to do a pre-treatment with OCP or with any of the hormones, please be careful. And also, you have to prepare the endometrium in those patients with estrogen. So be careful of getting her tested for all this. Be careful and get a physician checkup done for her before you put her on any kind of hormones, because you may cause more harm to her rather than helping her to get pregnant. So these are some of the precautions that you must take before putting any patient on any kind of hormonal pill, and especially if you're going to give it for long term. So with this, I take leave of you, and just a word on when fertility should return. Fertility, this is a very old report of 1997, but it is one of the reports which I could find, nothing after that, but is reduced briefly, but returns to normal within 3 months with no significant subsequent delay in conception. However, there are also reports which tell us that, if it has been used for a very long time, then just as I said, 5 years, in those cases, it can suppress the hypothalamus to such a large extent that the patient may report back with post-pill amenorrhea of a long duration. So post-pill amenorrhea is a known entity, and it can happen with pill users for a long time. So be careful and do remember all this when you are prescribing pills to patients for contraceptive purposes as well as for non-contraceptive purposes. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I did not bore you too much.
Not at all, ma'am. It was an excellent.
Thank you so much. And let me stop sharing my screen now. I don't know how to do that. 1 minute.
Thank you so much. Thank you.